We ended up with Mark Cuban's email because Sony got hacked a few years prior. When we messaged Mark Cuban and sent him a cold email, Mark Cuban invested $1 million at $5 million.
Synthesia might just be the biggest technology company that you have not heard of. What are you going to do with the 200 million?
It's really fucking hard to be a founder, right? The world is going to look like this in 10 years, which was a hard sell, and we were the right team to tackle that opportunity. And I don't buy this idea that developers in the Bay Area is like 3 times as good as they are in Europe. I think that's absolutely BS.
And Google and Nvidia have taken notice. Victor's company is making video creation completely AI automated.
Rather than buying the book on Amazon, waiting for it to arrive, reading 200 pages, of which most of it is probably outdated by the time I read it, a 20-minute video on YouTube can teach you much more, right? Just slap them into ChatGPT, just like dumb this down for me.
What does the future of YouTube look like? And since he's from Denmark, we obviously spoke about Denmark is in kind of like geopolitical news more than ever at the moment with Greenland. Let's talk about some of the other jobs that you might disrupt. That being podcasters and YouTubers. Right? Make sure you subscribe so we can continue to get bigger and bigger guests. Victor, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. You're here to celebrate some big news. The fact that Jimmy's Jobs of the Future has gone past 100,000 subscribers. I'm sure you're delighted.
I'm honored.
Well, you are quite a big moment. You are the fastest growing unicorn in the United Kingdom, as according to the Sunday Times list. But that news is just about to get a bit bigger, right?
It is. We're very excited to announce our SeriesE, raising $200 million at a $4 billion valuation. Doubling down on what's been a fantastic couple of years and a huge opportunity in AI video.
Who's backing you this time?
The round is led by GoogleVentures. It's one of our early investors. They invested first time in the Series B, and we're grateful for all of their support. A lot of the existing investors are investing as well. And then we're bringing in 2 new funds, Evantic, led by Matt Miller, and Head Sophia.
What's the difference between raising a Series E compared to that first round 10 years ago?
So I think that all depends on the traction, right? I think when you raise the first 2 rounds for us was incredibly difficult to raise. The first round was like basically me and Stefan, my co-founder, and Matthias and Lourdes, my 2 other co-founders, with a PowerPoint and what we thought was a good idea and turned out to be at least somewhat of a good idea. But back then was completely non-consensus. We were telling people in 2017, AI is going to be able to not just analyze data and find patterns for us, which was mainly like machine learning back then. It's going to be able to actually generate data and content. And in 10 years, you're going to be able to make a Hollywood film from your laptop with nothing but your imagination, right? When you look at that statement today, that seems very obvious. That's if it hasn't already happened, then it's very close to happening. But back then, it's very, very difficult for investors to draw the line between the tech we were showing them and where it could eventually go, which I think is very natural when you're investing ahead of the curve and you're building ahead of the curve. But those 2 rounds are very difficult because we had to find people who truly were believers and pioneers. And I think it's one of the areas where being in Europe is a lot harder. In the Valley, it's easier to find people who are tech optimists and want to believe and think ahead of the curve. In Europe, unfortunately, I think it's gotten a lot better since 2017. But it's very difficult to raise those rounds back then. But we're very lucky that we found some people who believed in us. Raising a Series E is very different, right? Like we've gone a long way from a PowerPoint deck, and the way you evaluate the business today is of course still based on the vision and what do we want to do and what we want to build. But now it's also a very real business, way past $100 million of AR in revenue, and so you kind of move from the first round being pure story almost to getting closer and closer to being evaluated like how you would evaluate a public company, right? But interestingly, because things were going really well, the later stage rounds have actually been almost easier to raise than some of the earlier stage rounds, which makes no sense from the outside. That raising $1 million back in 2017 took us 10 times as long as it took us to raise the latest $200 million round. But that's some of those like weird mechanics that you you see in this industry.
You always get time. Who wrote who wrote the first check? Can you remember?
Mark Cuban did. Mark Cuban invested $1 million at $5 million post.
Wow.
So I'm pretty sure we're his best angel investment he's ever made.
Yeah,
and
I bet.
Yeah, I think
this is a Dragon's Den US Dragon's Den guy, right? For those that might not know, yeah.
Exactly. I think the backstory on Mark Cuban is pretty interesting because obviously he's mainly known as being the guy in Dragon Shark Tank. It's called in the US.
Yeah.
But actually, before that, he built and sold a company that he sold to Yahoo for $3 billion, and he was the first person who brought radio to the internet, which today seems like, it's kind of like what we're doing right now. But back then, that was a completely ludicrous idea. And I think when he saw us and he heard about what we're trying to do, he saw a lot of parallels. Back when he was saying, "Hey, I want to bring radio to the internet," people were like, "That's completely ridiculous. The tech's not going to be able to support. It's going to be way too expensive.
Yeah.
Who would want to listen to radio on their computer, right? You have a radio right there. Why would you need that?"
Yeah.
And so Mark's actually incredibly visionary in terms of tech, and Synthesia as a company stems from a research paper that my co-founder Matthias Niesner did when he was a professor at Stanford. And when we messaged Mark Cuban and sent him a cold email, we quickly found out that he actually implemented this paper himself at home, with a lecture, right? So I think my kind of entrepreneurship lesson from raising that round was that we talked to, way more than 100 people who all said no, because we were trying to both convince them that the world is going to look like this in 10 years, which was a hard sell, and we were the right team to tackle that opportunity. And with Mark Cuban and some of the other early investors, we didn't have to convince them of the vision. He already was completely sold on the idea that AI is going to be able to generate film, movies, speech, whatever. He was only evaluating us as the team to tackle that opportunity, right? And it's just generally much easier to find people who already believe in your vision and they value you as a team, as opposed to having to both convince someone on a non-consensus vision and the team, right? Like back in those days, everybody wanted to invest in fintech.
Yeah.
Right? Like everyone believed in that. So if you went out and wanted to start a fintech company, they'd evaluate you as a team and of course the idea you had, but you wouldn't have to convince them that like this is a market that's going to exist eventually.
So how did you go about getting the kind of like cold email? Like what was that process like, and how did he agree to kind of invest? Because that's a heck of a first check investor.
So it was, we were pretty young, me and Stefan, my other operational co-founder, and we were just hustling to try and get this thing off the ground. So we obviously were young, had a lot of belief in the idea, but we also needed money, right? And so we had this long list of people who we thought could be interesting, and we got turned down by almost everyone. We ended up with Mark Cuban's email because Sony got hacked a few years prior, and you could actually download that data dump on the internet. And in that data dump, there was a lot of emails from Mark Cuban, talking about like the Shark Tank production. And so we found his email in there. We sent him the email, and he responded back within like 5 minutes, just asking us like a bunch of questions around. We sent him like a demo and a few words on what we were trying to build. And then we had this 14-hour email conversation with him. Mark Cuban doesn't do video calls and he doesn't do phone calls, only email. So we had this like 14-hour conversation with him over email, and at like 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, something like that, UK time, he was basically like, I'll do $1 million if the diligence checks out.
Yeah.
And the diligence checked out. We went to LA to visit him and spent a day with him on the set of Shark Tank, which was really fun. Had lunch with him.
Yeah.
And that was the official start to the company.
So you're there back and forth email. I mean, that must have been. I wonder what that's like now in a sort of ChatGPT world as well. Like, it's quite interesting in that, because of course that's one of the great advantages that you've got, right? Is that everyone wants to invest in AI companies now, whereas you've been doing your Series A, B, C rounds before that ChatGPT even existed, right?
Yeah.
Well, ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think there's like three stages of Synthesia. There was like the kind of, it wasn't really, let's call it pre-generative AI era, which is from 2017 to around, 2020, where, the tech didn't really work. We're doing some demos. We had this technology where we could kind of like translate a video, take an advertisement that was shot in English and give you a French version of it by reanimating the face to match a different voiceover. And it was, we did make some money off it, and it did sort of work, but it was just clearly not like a very scalable business. That part of the company was very, very difficult. The next phase was we actually built something that worked. It started to scale. It was a web app, very easy to use. We essentially went from trying to build technology for Hollywood studios and video production companies and video experts to your average office worker can generate a video in just a few seconds. That started working, and the company started getting traction. So we went from $0 to $1 million in AR in something like 3 or 4 months, which is, today that's like less special, but back then was very special, right? And so we started growing really quickly. And of course, as soon as we started growing really quickly, investors took note and it became a lot easier to raise money. And then the company started growing really quickly. And then when ChatGPT was released, and all of a sudden, AI was just the thing everybody talks about,
Yeah.
still is today, right? That was like one more accelerant to the business. So it's been kind of interesting, like those 3 stages of like, nothing is working, no traction at all, to the business is working. People weren't talking about AI yet, but the business is working really fast. And then once AI really started taking off, just the kind of the kind of macro effect that had on the business, right?
Because people can see like, okay, well, we can generate scripts, like, and then we can turn scripts into video with me just sort of sitting.
But it's also just all of a sudden everyone is like Googling AI tools. There's watching the TikTok. Everybody's talking about like AI tool, Synthesia, ChatGPT, Lovable, all these other things, right? Everyone is constantly talking about AI tools.
Yeah.
Which meant that, and we were actually, I wouldn't say we were a mature product, but by the time ChatGPT got released, right, we've been building our product for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Which means that we were actually one of the few companies that had an offering that wasn't just like a demo slapped together in 2 weeks. We had something real. We had something that was pretty unique. So just the fact that the world was like, and every business in the world was like, how's AI going to change my business? How do I make sure that I don't miss the wave? Like all that, it's just like, it's just a massive accelerant in terms of customer acquisition and general interest and willingness from budget holders to spend budget on AI tools. So I think there's, in some sense, you could say we were too early because the very first years of the company was not very fun and things didn't work. But on the other hand, you could also say we were right on time, right? We just had to endure those like 3 or 4 years of like very painful
training, right? Like,
kind of running against the wall. But once, everything started taking off, we were really well positioned.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And so what are you going to do with the 200 million then, right? Like what are you going to deploy that in?
So, I mean, it's going to go into, what you'd expect, product development, customer acquisition. The big thing for us is, when we founded the company, we founded it based on basically 2 big ideas. The first one being that AI is going to, reduce the marginal cost of creating content to basically 0, meaning that you can generate anything from your computer without needing anything else than just your imagination, right? I think that's kind of happening right now.
Yeah.
In a couple of years, you will be able to see like cinematic content, I think, generated with AI to the point where you cannot tell that it's being AI generated. That's a huge business opportunity because it's kind of like going from a printing press to typing on a keyboard, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the scale of content production. And I think that's very much the business opportunity we've tackled up until now. The second big idea is that when we invent new media technology as humans, the first phase of it is always that we use new technology to create old media formats, which is what we're doing today. We're creating video as we've always known it, right? You create one video, everybody watches exactly the same version of the video. It's a broadcast, it's from A to B, and so on and so forth. But when we invent new media technology, we always invent new media formats. So the $100 billion question in our market, right, is like, what does truly AI native video look like? It doesn't look like a broadcast. It's probably much more, every video is tailored to the person who's watching it, right? If you're watching an educational video about something and there's something you don't understand, you can ask that video a question, which you obviously can't do on YouTube, right?
Yes.
If you're doing a corporate training thing, like what we're doing, a sales training, rather than just having people watch a video passively and hoping they understand the content, the video can go into a conversational mode where the video pretends to be a customer, and you have, as a salesperson, you have to overcome objections, prove you've actually understood the content in the same way you would role play with your manager, for example.
Yeah.
Right? So there's lots of different avenues that this can go, and that's a chapter we're moving into now. We're launching our first product. It's in beta right now with 25 customers. It's going to go into GA in a couple of months, and that is essentially AI native video, right? And I think the easiest way of thinking about it is like video you can talk to and video you can interact with. It could be that you do the sales training thing, which is the first product we're launching, where you're actually being examined by the AI, or the AI helps you, like a tutor or your manager would, to understand the content you're consuming. It could be that you're, as a candidate, you're watching a video about the job role that you're taking, but the video is also going to give you a live case study on the call, so you can prove your skill set beyond just uploading your CV, for example. And there's a gazillion other examples of how you can use these things. And that's essentially what we're moving into now, right? And I think if you look at kind of like what is the opportunity in this segment, I think whoever managed to nail those use cases becomes very, very big, because it takes video, as we're doing it today, from being purely around communication to actually being some degree of lightweight, like process automation, right? You can have these videos actually teach your sales team, not just like communicate something to them. You can have them help with onboarding instead of having a person onboarding everyone in the company with the same slides, the same 2 hours every single week. You can do that with one of these like video agents instead.
Do you think though there's a danger with it? As you were talking about that, like I sometimes think about technology and it doesn't actually end up at times making us more productive. So if you can ask a salesperson 25 questions, you'll just end up doing it. Like I just, as you were talking there about it, it just made me think like, okay, we're going to create all this content, more and more content, but actually, aren't we going to lose some of the human skills in terms of like, well, risk taking, I suppose?
You could argue that in some cases it will probably change like our behavior, and maybe there's going to be some things that makes us less productive. But I think in the case of this, I think what we're seeing so far, and this is not just in Synthesia, but also when you look at like education with kids, for example, that when you have a space where kind of no one is watching,
Yeah.
you're a lot more vulnerable, and you're much more okay asking stupid questions, for example, or doing 10 practice runs because you're not. So role playing is in most sales teams is a integral part of being a manager, right? You role play with your team members. So maybe I feel like you're not 10 out of 10 in product knowledge. So we'll sit down and I'll pretend to be a customer and we'll kind of do a few role plays to make sure you've understood the concept. That's a very normal way of teaching salespeople how to sell. And so with this, what you can do is you can have that available in any language 24/7. It has a memory of all the previous interactions you've had. So you can actually begin to build a data set of like, what are you good at, what are you less good at, which helps you get better at your job, right?
Yeah.
Of course, I think there is like, you don't want to be just sitting and like role playing all the time instead of actually going on sales calls. That's not going to be very much productive. But I do think that one of the biggest and most interesting use case with AI is actually education as a general theme, right? This is education in a corporate context with a sales team. But looking at myself and like how I learn things now, if you like 3 or 4 years ago, I would always say, I love reading.
Yeah.
And I still do read, but I mostly read fiction today because of the art form. If I want to learn something, it's at least like 5-6 years ago, I started going on YouTube instead, right? Because rather than buying the book on Amazon, waiting for it to arrive, reading 200 pages, of which most of it is probably outdated by the time I read it, a 20-minute video on YouTube can teach you much more, right? So video is like the easiest way of learning. And I think what's happening now is that increasingly it's going to be a mix of video, but also these like using LLMs, right? Like when I want to learn something today, I don't know if you've had any experience with this, but it's just phenomenal at putting together like curriculum, asking you questions, explaining it in. It's like, give me an analogy that's close to another topic that I'm really good at understanding. It's just like extremely powerful to have this like AI tutor that can help you understand things really quickly.
I know what you mean about asking the basic questions as well. I was doing some stuff for my pension the other day, and like pensions is one of these things that everyone sort of pretends they understand and whatever, but only thinks about it once every 3 or 4 years. And it was like, I basically spent, and I was like, oh, okay, I kind of like, I get it all now and whatever. And even like comparing what your pension pot is to the national average and all that kind of stuff. It was like, yeah, it was just sort of really, it's really interesting. And it was, I was asking you probably quite a lot of dumb questions really, but you just get clarity on it, etc.
Yeah.
Well, go on. What have you used it for?
I use it for, I just bought an apartment, for example, right? And it's also like one of those things you do a few times throughout your life. You're talking to a solicitor and like all these like, old English documents that have gazillions of pages. And everyone has the feeling I should probably sit down and read this and make sure I'm not like signing onto something that I disagree with. That's bad. But it's just the language is tough, right? And then you have to call your lawyer. That they have like, they can't say some things, they can't advise on something, which is kind of annoying. Just slap them into ChatGPT, just like dumb this down for me, summarize the key points, anything here that's out of the ordinary, right? And it's interesting because that actually teaches you so much about the process just by like dumbing down the language, giving you the summarized version of like a 15-page document. And so I think it's not just that you can say, at least for my own personal thing, like it's not just that I'm like, hey, is this okay? And I just follow blindly what GPT tells me. It's actually that I learned something about like, what are these things in a way that I probably wouldn't if it would take me a very long time to sit down and read all these documents, right? So I think it helps. It can also dumb us down if you're just blindly asking it and just going whatever it says. But if used in the right way, I think it's an amazing tool for learning.
Again, the house thing, property purchase is one of those things where I often think about like how anyone bought it before email is beyond me, right? Like it's one of these things where technology slightly ends up creating more work and makes the process like longer and longer. But that is a really useful case study on it. Why did you? Where did the name Synthesia come from? Here's a clip, Sonny.
If I could change it, I probably would. So it actually comes from. So my big passion outside of work is music. And in music, especially electronic music, you use synthesizers, right? Which is essentially digital instruments that originally were made to emulate physical instruments. So instead of having to travel around with like all the instruments in the world, you could just have a keyboard and you could have you could play like the guitar and like whatever. And of course, synthesizers today is a very big part of producing music. And I think there's a very obvious link to what we're doing with video, right? We're synthesizing video instead of filming in the real world. We're using digital technology to recreate something that looks and feels entirely real. And then one of my favorite films is Synthesia, which is an old Disney cartoon. And it started as just like a code word for the project, and then it just kind of like stuck on. I think there's a lot of things I like about it, but it's very difficult to pronounce, which is a problem, as we just saw before.
God, no, but I think that's interesting. It's a lovely question to ask people because it's obviously like takes people back to those core moments of where they were kind of like sitting at the kitchen table, etc.
Exactly.
Were there any other names that you considered?
Not really, because it was more like a code. It was just like
a code name.
It was exactly that. I was sitting in my room, and I was like, I'm making this deck. I gotta call it something, and then that came to mind.
What's it been like? You're now almost 600 people, right? You'll probably be maybe hiring a couple hundred more as well. Like, what has the hiring process been like, and where have the kind of like step change moments been on that journey?
So, early days when we had nothing, and we were both 25, 26 years old. It's very difficult to hire. You always get this advice of just only hire like rock stars. Like the first people you hire are the most important, and that's great advice. You should definitely hire all the rock stars you can get. But in the early days of a company, right, it's hard because you can't. For most people, at least, very difficult to go to someone who works at like a Meta or Google and say, "Hey, I think you are an absolute rock star. Why don't you come join my company?" Because you probably can't afford their salary, and at that point in time, right, you're just a person with a PowerPoint or maybe like a very early version of the technology. So in the early days, it's all about finding kind of diamonds in the dirt. I think is one way of putting it, right? Which are these people that are truly great, but they don't have the CV to demonstrate it yet, or they live in some random town where for some reason there's just not like a Meta or like a Google that's going to snap them up, but they didn't go to like a Stanford or like some big important university. And the way you find those people, right, is by interviewing a lot of people and trying to figure out like what are the signals, what characterizes like this type of person who has a lot of potential, but maybe hasn't sort of outlived it yet, right? And those are the people you want to find a lot of. We were also fortunate that two of our co-founders were professors, so they had some PhD students, which was an easier inning. We obviously needed AI researchers to actually build the initial version of the product. And we were very lucky to get a bunch of like truly great people who were straight off their PhD, so they were young, they're very good, and they're excited about the space that we were working in. And of course, we gave them, obviously you want to give them equity and options and give them like great upside in the company. Then it changes over time. I think
just before let's go into, but just this is almost a sidebar on this, but who are a couple of those people be interested? I think there's a fascinating series to be done in terms of like people that join companies like in the first 20 or so, because I think we lionize founders, rightly so, but actually there's people that join early are almost kind of like doing a lot of the risk as well with less of the upside, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I'd be fascinated, and maybe tell me after a couple of people like early on that were particularly good, because it'd be great to interview them as well. But
I have a lot of those. I think we're.
I bet. But then you hit 50 people, etc.
Yeah, I mean, then you start growing, and then the company obviously starts working, which means you get a little bit more leverage when you're talking to candidates. But I think even up until a couple of hundred people, we were mostly hiring people that I would call, underdogs is a strong word, but I think almost on purpose, actually, like not trying to hire people from, big name brand logos, but trying to really find people where they're most like, hiring people that are truly hungry, that
Something to
are
prove,
very smart, have something to prove, want to put the work in, are humble about the fact that like no one knows anything, and you get this feeling that they will they will put in the work, and they'll have to have the raw intelligence to really kind of perform very well. I think those people are so important those early days. The thing that can happen, and of course this is like a very broad generalization, is that you go out and you're like, oh my God, I need this person from Dropbox or Figma, pick your name brand, right? You talk to these people like, yeah, I was responsible for growing from 50 million AR to 300 million AR, and of course there are some absolute rock stars in these companies, and if you hire them, you're very lucky, and they can come in, and they hopefully have enough like mental plasticity to not just apply the same playbook, because every company is very different, and they may be worth the money, right? Yeah. But there's also a lot of people who are great, but whose ego is maybe a bit out of touch with what their actual impact was, right? Like, would Dropbox have grown from $300 to $800 million of ARR if you weren't there?
Yeah.
The answer to that is that for 90% of the people who worked in growth and marketing, the answer is probably yes. And that doesn't mean that you're not great, but it means that some people, right, if they've been on this sort of rapid journey, sometimes I think have a kind of an incongruence in terms of like, what they can bring to the table, and that can be very toxic, right? Because you as a founder, if you're young, you'll come in and be like, I should listen to this person who's seen it before. They know what truly great looks like, and then you end up applying a lot of playbooks that maybe worked at that point in time for that company, but doesn't work for your own company, right? So the allure of like hiring people with great CVs that can just solve the problem for you because they've seen it before is generally a trap. When you get to some level of scale in the business, like the scale we're at now, it applies much more. But it is a mistake I see a lot of people do early on, right? Which is like you hire people with fancy CVs because they have fancy CVs, and that could be dangerous. So our strategy was always like hire people with raw ambition, raw talent, raw intelligence, especially when you're building a company like ours where there's no playbook, right? We were one of the first like AI native companies to emerge. We had to figure out like how to grow. We had to learn that for the first couple of years, the best way to attract enterprise clients was TikTok. Like there's no growth marketer from the previous generation of SaaS companies who would have told us that, right? And that only worked because our technology was an enterprise technology, but it also had a huge wow factor. It was jaw dropping, right? So you could drive that like viral interest, and it's like all these lessons you have to learn for the first time, especially if you're doing something that's sort of like highly innovative.
Yeah.
And then of course as you progress through, right? I think now we hire a lot of people that are great and are much more senior and have seen stuff, and we can afford them. We compete more with like the big tech companies. So the profile of people you hire throughout the journey of the company, right, does change over time.
But I think the point about how it changes, and particularly with an AI world as well, like how quickly it is, because we're often looking at like people that we might be able to recruit and whatever, and we speak to plenty of people who've worked at Diary of a CEO and whatever, but it's like what got Stephen Bartlett from 100,000 subscribers to 500,000 was 3 years ago now. It's going to look quite different actually, like, and plus the content's different, or like there's actually like so many variables, but it can be very easy to kind of cling on to that like as a founder and be like, because actually most of the time you're making decisions, I think when it comes to hiring, like quite often on instinct, right? Raw intelligence, raw adaptability and so on. Yeah, it's really
but I think it's also just because it's really fucking hard to be a founder, right? Like you have a lot of problems on your plate all the time, and you're always hoping that you can get someone in who can just fix it for you.
Yeah.
And you can sometimes get people who can fix it for you, which is great, but it's unfortunately not as easy as just for you hiring someone who'd been on a podcast that was growing really quickly.
Yeah.
Like that's not a guarantee that person understood the lessons and that it's the same lessons that still apply and so on and so forth. But I think it's a very human thing, right? That you look at someone like, okay, this happened over here. This person will probably know how to do it. And sometimes it does apply, but I think especially with things like growth marketing and actually in everything, right? Product growth, marketing, whatever, just the playbooks change. If you want to be a top 1% company, you have to pave the way, right?
Yeah.
By the time it's common sense to do some specific growth tactic, everyone is doing it, right? And all these like growth tactics, they have such a quick like decay. So you want to be the ones who discover them before people start writing blog posts about them.
Yeah. Exactly. You're talking about it on podcasts.
Are you a fan of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future? Hi, I'm Sonny, one of the producers behind the show. And we don't just make this podcast, we produce some of the best business content out there, working with global brands and founders. Over the past year, we've flown around the world and demand keeps growing. And with 4 prime ministers trusting us with their appearances on this show, you're in safe hands. So, if you're already in the market for a podcast or standout business content, why not start with us? Drop me a line at sunny@boxlight.io, try our podcast calculator, or book a meeting at boxlight.io. That's boxlight.io. Now, back to Jimmy.
And let's talk about a bit about like the sort of cultural differences, because you spent a bit of time at Stanford and so on, and UK, Denmark, Europe as well. Because you are very, like, you believe that you can build a world-leading top 1% AI company from Europe, right?
Yeah. I think it definitely. I mean, there's pros and cons, right? I think the cons is very well known, but I think there are also some pros.
So what are the pros then?
I think the most important pro is actually on talent, which a lot of people don't expect me to say. But what people forget is that if you're in the Bay Area, yes, there's a lot of amazing people who are very good at what they do. But there's also a lot of amazing companies with a lot of money who are also trying to hire people at the same scale that you are, right? So what's happening in the Valley is very high concentration of great people. But if you look at the average tenure in the Bay Area versus in Europe, for example, it's much shorter, right? Because there's always like the company next door is growing faster. It just hired like an even cooler AI researcher than you have. And there's this sort of constant, people switching jobs and going to building their own kind of personal stock portfolio and so on. And there's a lot of positive things about that as well. But it is a lot harder to compete on talent if you're in the Bay Area because there's just so many options, right?
Yeah.
In Europe, we don't have like that many great companies, and I think especially if you're like a top 5% or top 1% company in Europe, you have something that's pretty unique, right? And there's a lot of great talent in Europe. I don't buy this idea that developers in the Bay Area is like 3 times as good as they are in Europe.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely BS. People in Europe in general, I think, are more loyal, which has a good side to it and a bad side to it. The good side to it is as an employer, most people care about, of course, a good salary. They care about a job that they like with colleagues that they like. In the US, right, a lot of people think of it more as like building their own personal stock portfolio. In Europe, people don't care so much about that. And that maybe means that there's some edge of ambition that's like taking off or taken off. But I think as an employer, I think, there's so many great people in Europe. And if you are a top 5% to 1% company, it's much easier to hoover up that talent and build a really strong company. Whereas in the Bay Area, again, you're just competing much more with more people. Where it does get harder on talent is in more senior roles, because Europe don't have that many big tech companies who've seen hundreds of millions of AR, hyper growth, tier 1 products. It becomes more difficult because, we have an office in New York as well, right? So we have a big team there. But you generally have to find those people in the US and either move them to Europe or maybe to New York, which is obviously harder, right? You already have like a strong filter, and you need to find people that are willing to relocate most of the time.
How did you find your time at Stanford? Because I did a couple of months there on an exec course as well, and found it like it was very useful.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was there for like 1 semester, basically on my bachelor's, and I think prior to that I was living in Copenhagen in Denmark, and I was working in the Danish kind of startup ecosystem. I was loving it, and I wanted to build a company, and I was like, I want to go to Stanford, to Silicon Valley, and see what it's all about, right? And I think I left with 2 impressions. The first one, absolutely amazing. The people you met there, the level of conversations that were had were just completely different, right? You're at a party, and someone is talking about how they're gonna like cure cancer, right? Another person's talking about their new company they started and just raised $5 million. But it's like the level of ambition and the celebration of ambition and drive is just so different than Denmark, which is a great country, but the complete opposite. A lot of like tall poppy syndrome in Denmark, right? And I think that was just amazing, feeling that energy, the ambition, and the fact that everyone like wanted other people to succeed as well. That was absolutely magical, and was definitely transformative for me. I think it helped me think bigger also. In Denmark, when I was working in startups, I did a lot of interesting projects, but it was like building a bookkeeping system for Danish companies, right? Or doing some other like business process tooling thing. And a lot of that I think were interesting, but what I definitely learned at Stanford was I love these like weird fringe ideas, sci-fi stuff. And if you weren't in Denmark, if you were over there, that was like no one looked weird at you if you said, I want to build like an AI video company, right? at a time where that seemed crazy. So I absolutely loved that, and it was a very transformative period in my life for sure. The other part of it, which I thought was kind of interesting, was I think I came over there, and obviously being very immersed from a distance in the whole community and the content and the people and so on. You come to Silicon Valley, right, and you expect something that looks like a Silicon Valley, right, with like lots of cool tech and flying cars and whatever. And Palo Alto is like, if you don't know that you're in Silicon Valley, you'd be like, I'm in this like random small American city with like a bunch of restaurants and a few shops, and that's it, right? Like,
It's pretty rudimentary.
It's a very, I mean, Stanford is a beautiful place, but the area around it, I just remember just like being completely shocked at like, is this Silicon Valley? But it is, and I mean, it's part of the culture and the appeal, right? That it's like very, I guess
There's
like
nothing to
low-key.
distract.
There's, nothing,
Yeah.
there's definitely nothing to distract you, right? There's like one bar in town or something.
And what's great about London specifically as well, right? Let's sort of like big London up a bit, like, because it sometimes gets a bit of shade thrown at it at the moment by lots of places. What do you think is great about London and growing an AI unicorn company?
I mean, I think if you're in Europe, I think it's the only like real place to build a big global company. I think it has. I think it is like, by far the best city in in Europe in terms of being a melting pot and a magnet for ambitious, driven people. Right? I think you see that everywhere. People come to London from all over. Some come here to just like work in banking in 4 years, but even those people also decided to leave their home country. They made it through the application process and they got here and they stay for 4 years. We have so many people who come here because they have a dream or an ambition, in the same way that you see in like New York or San Francisco or other like big metropolitan cities. And I think outside of just obviously meeting the people, which could be your co-founder, it could be your colleagues, it could be your employees, I think it also gives an energy to the city that's very different from most other European cities. On top of that, of course, you have the capital markets here, which I think is much better. I think today it probably matters a bit less, but back in 2017, I'd say like VC wasn't as global as it is today.
Yeah.
And then I think, culturally, it's the closest we have to the US, easy to travel to the US. And so I think London is, I think it is the best city.
London, New York is the world's international most common flight, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. So I think it's their challenge in the UK for sure. It's a challenge in London, absolutely. But I even think from things like, tax, wealth perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm from Denmark, right? So for me, the UK is still like a pretty good place to reside. And let's hope the government doesn't,
Bring in the exit tax.
Exactly.
I don't think they're going to do that after the problems it caused last time. I want to ask a bit about Denmark. So obviously Denmark is in kind of like geopolitical news more than ever at the moment with Greenland, etc. Like, what's the kind of relationship like when you're at school? Like, how much you taught about Greenland? Like, just what is the kind of relationship like?
I mean, you learn about Greenland, right, and the history of the two countries, which is, I think, it has been kind of like challenging throughout the years. Obviously, it is. Greenland is like it's a huge country, but it has a very small population, and there is this like sister brother kind of relationship, right? But I think for most Danish people, I don't think Greenland is like, now obviously it's on everyone's mind because of everything that's going on, but I wouldn't say it's not something that you
don't sort of go on a trip there aged 11, sort of funded by the government or whatever.
No, not really. So it's very interesting that Denmark, being a very small country in the world, with Greenland in terms of population size, now is at the center of like maybe one of the biggest geopolitical conflicts in NATO we've seen in a while.
But Denmark as well, just generally, is often held up as an example. I mean, in public policy, when I was in government as well, and I know you spent a bit of time in government as well, but it's like, the Nordic countries were often sort of held up as like, had done very well on childcare, or had done very well on this, and why do you think that is in particular? Is it because they're quite sort of small nations, so things, but also of a scale that things can be experimented with? I
mean, look, I think Scandinavian countries, and I think Denmark is an amazing country, and I usually say, I think for the average citizen, it's probably the best place in the world you can live.
Yeah.
Because of all those things, right? I think some of the things that I don't think works very well is again those things around tall poppy syndrome, celebrating drive and ambition. There's this like very kind of strange stat, which is like amount of unicorn founders per capita. And if I remember correctly, Denmark is actually like one of the first countries on the list, right? The issue is that no one does it in Denmark. There's lots of great big tech companies that are founded by Danish people. I know most of them, and no one does it in Denmark, right? That's a problem because in Denmark we haven't produced any, I think maybe one now, but we haven't produced a company with more than 1,000 employees in more than 15 years. So we're living off old industries, and we have a lot of great companies, Lego, Bestseller, Novo Nordisk, etc. So I think they're amazing countries. I think there's so much that we should learn from those in the rest of the world. I do think the but though is that Denmark is 5 million people. It's an extremely homogeneous population, right? There's basically very little religion. There's very little immigration. And that just makes it a lot easier to build these kind of societies. It's very hard to just take that model of society and then apply it to like the US or to the UK or like anywhere else. But I think from a values perspective, and I think in terms of how the societies work, they're amazing places. And I'm very proud to be from Denmark.
How many people do you think you will get to in terms, like what's the ambition on that side? So let me like sort of give a bit of context to that. Your stat there about Denmark only creating one company over 1,000 people in the last 50 years, I think it's really interesting because if you look at the companies in the United Kingdom, the biggest over the last 10, 15 years that have been created, basically looking at Octopus Energy, and very few others have created over 10,000 people. And it's one of my worries for jobs of the future, right, is that actually, we're not going to see those big companies being created anymore. And look at you guys, reaching 4 billion valuation with 600 people. Right? It's pretty incredible, actually, if you look at that in the context of history. Yeah. Like, what size do you think you might grow to if you achieved everything that you wanted to do and listed? What would...
I mean, that's very hard to say, right? I think there's, of course, like one force, right, which is that with AI, people can do more with less. So there's a lot of people who, there's, the people talking about like the one-person $1 billion startup or like a 10-person, $10 billion startup, whatever. And directionally, I think there's a lot of things that's true about that. Definitely you can do more with less. But I tend to think this idea that AI is just going to replace everyone with agents and that there's not going to be a lot of jobs left is not going to pan out that way. Jobs will definitely change. They'll probably change very quickly. But I think in 10 years' time, if you look at a company with 500 employees who are all extremely good at using agents and automations and so on and so forth, I think they can still do more than a 10-person company who's also really good at using agents and so on. So that I think humans still will be the most important part of companies in the future. But you can definitely do more with less, right? So probably what we will see is just that way more software will be created. Software will get much more personalized, and there'll be a whole bunch of new roles and definitions that will come. But if you look at all the big AI companies who are all espousing this idea that AI can take up roles, they're all the companies in the world that are hiring the most, right? So I think that
And I just don't see how one person, because I see that argument about the one person creating $1 billion startup, but I don't see how it actually works. Like in terms of, if somebody does that, they'll just be competitors that move into that space, right? We just talk about, growth hacking and whatever, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think, I don't know, maybe can it happen at some point? Maybe it can. I mean, we are seeing very small teams do a lot, right? Yeah. But I think we're also very early in the AI economy. I think no one knows how this stuff's going to play out over the long term. And I think what a lot of companies, including my own, who had the first mover advantage of figuring out like these new products early on, there's many chapters to be written still around like how do you build truly defensible businesses? What are the moats in AI? And often those turn out to be less about the tech and more about the distribution, for example, right? Yeah. The customer base that you manage to drive. The fact that if you look at true enterprise software, right, that is such a that is so driven by humans, which I think a lot of tech people often underestimate. But this is like executives and salespeople and selling things which is so far removed from evaluating the actual piece of tech, and it's much more about the relationships between those companies, right? That ends up like truly mattering. And of course, that's all that stuff's going to change. But yeah, I think I'm also skeptical that we're just going to see a bunch of like, one-person $1 billion startups emerge. I think we'll see that a one person can definitely create a much bigger business today
Yeah.
and in 5 years than they could 10 years ago. I have no doubt about.
Completely.
But I still think we'll see very big companies. And I think a lot of those companies will be. The human element will still be very important.
But it did used to be such a thing. I always think of, like, particularly in the startup world, was like, how much have you raised and who have you raised from? But also, how many people do you employ, right? It was a real kind of like status marker to be able to kind of like say those two things. And that in the last couple of years has changed big time, right? Much more about revenue per employee now, etc. Right?
Yeah. No, I agree for sure. It's definitely become like and for good reason, right? Like obviously, if you're doing 500 million AR with 100 people, that's very impressive, right?
Yeah.
But I just think, as with anything in life, there's not like a single answer to that. For some companies, maybe that's amazing. I think if you're building a company that's sales led, which we are, enterprise sales is most of our revenue. From where we are right now in 2026. Still very hard to close multi-million-dollar contracts and asking people to put down a credit card or just like self-service their way to that, right? And that will probably also change over time, but I still think there'll probably still be humans signing off on like $1 million budgets even in 3 or 4 or 5 years time.
But let's talk about some of the other jobs that you might disrupt.
Yeah.
That being podcasters and YouTubers, right? Like, I think it's a big thing, right? Like in terms of this, because I was like, it wouldn't be that hard. Both you and I have created plenty of content, whatever, put into ChatGPT, generate a conversation between the two of us. You could have been here for 5 minutes. You know, we could have done it, then dubbed it, and then kind of created a sort of hour-long thing, right? Like that is really not that far away.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's so many different types of content, and I think that the end consumer will evaluate different types of content in different ways, right? So if you're making a video about how to change your password on your ChatGPT account, for example, no one is going to care that that's an AI voiceover or an AI avatar or whatever that's showing you how to do that. It's a very like practical utilitarian thing, right? On the other hand, if you get a birthday message from a friend or your boss, you'll probably care, or you have to deliver like a really difficult message as a CEO to your company, and you send that as your AI avatar doing that, that'll probably be received pretty negatively, right?
Yeah.
They probably want to have like a real person in front of it. And so I think every type of content will just be evaluated differently. And I think things like podcasts, for example, like if our conversation was just generated by the two GPTs of us having a conversation and then we rendered it out, I mean, we don't know, of course, what that would look like. Maybe that would be like a very interesting conversation. But I think people want like the real conversation between us, right? And I think we will care a lot about how content is made, if it's real video or not real video, even as AI can begin to replace a lot of the actual kind of like production process.
Yeah, because that's it, right? Because I see, like, and it's interesting, right? Because the way that we've built out a sustainable business model for this partly is spinning out a production company that helps entrepreneurship companies, ecosystem make really interesting video and podcasts. But I can totally see that might only be a viable business model for 3 or 4 years with everything that you guys are doing, right? Making it so much more kind of accessible to people. But then there still needs to be like a slight human understanding. It's like when people say, "Oh, well, we're not going to need coders anymore." It's like, well, I can't code, and the AI is not going to be able to do it for me unless I put in decent instructions, right? Like you're going to have lots of kind of like baseline knowledge in lots of areas. I think is the way it's kind of like going forward.
I also just think that in the attention economy, right, which is what you're a part of, right? The problem is not that there's not enough content out there. There's so much content, even pre-AI, right?
Yeah.
The issue with like the way that you win in podcasting, for example, is by making a really truly great product, right? Mm-hmm. And that is, the last 10% and 5%. And actually being a top 1% podcast is really, really hard. And that's not because it's difficult to set up cameras, right? It's because it's really hard to get the right guests in, to have a good conversation, to keep people entertained. And so I think what you are seeing, right, is that the curation will just, a lot of the slop content, like badly produced content, today, even no AI, right, will just, it doesn't funnel to the top and no one wants to listen to it. And so I think with this stuff, I'm pretty sure if we did this podcast as being like an AI generated thing, not a lot of people would listen to it. And maybe there's a world in which you cannot tell the difference and it truly just is as good, and maybe I'll have to eat my words. But I still think that the way that you decide to hold this conversation, the questions that you ask me, it's not, I mean, you're not just asking me 10 questions that a GPT could have written, right? You've done a lot of research and I'm presuming, changing your questions depending on my answers.
Yeah.
And I think, though, the skill in that is still going to be really, really important, right?
Definitely.
And even if there's a world in which we maybe don't have to sit here and record it, but we can generate that, I still think the conversation we'd have would still have to be guided and directed by you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think it will raise the bar essentially, right? Because it
will for sure raise the bar.
Yeah, right. It makes the research, like I'm able to research you and basically like everything you've ever said, like much kind of like quicker than a couple of years ago and so on. And I think it will sort of, and I often think about you guys as an example of video production. It's going to be a bit like the Airbnb and Uber thing, right? Yeah. Of where they came into the marketplace, they disrupted it, but actually private hire vehicles rose and journeys taken across the board, and the amount of holidays, hotels are up as well as Airbnb, right? Like, and I think that's essentially what you're going to end up doing for video production a lot.
For sure, right? It's a market expansion.
Yeah.
Exercise as much as it. Even today, I'd say there's definitely like content people would have otherwise filmed with a camera that they now make in Synthesia, but the majority of the content that people make with Synthesia would just not have been a video before because it would have been too cumbersome, right?
Yeah.
So I think the production process will change a lot, obviously. But I mean, if you look at text, right, there was a time in which if you wanted to create something and distribute something in text, right, that was a very expensive and very time-consuming process because you need to get a printing press. Now you have a bunch of like newspapers or whatever, and you have to distribute it to people all around the world. And that takes a lot of time and effort. Then when computers arrived and we started to create websites and things like that, also everyone could create anything. And so we got flooded by like a gazillion times more content, but we also became much more critical of what we actually want to spend our time on, right?
Yeah.
So I think the quality bar will continue to go up. And I think, for example, in a conversation like this, what AI maybe can do in the future is like as we're talking about things, it'll pull in like, relevant images, like there'll be a map of Greenland or some fact about Greenland when we're discussing that. Like there'll be a lot of that stuff which can kind of augment and make easier.
Yeah.
But it'll probably still be doing the job of like a video editor, a really good video editor, and you probably still want someone who understands the language of video, right? If you just take a random person off the street, I'm still skeptical that they'll be able to create like top 1% content even within the foreseeable future. Not all content needs to be top 1%. If you get a lot of content we make for our customers, it doesn't need to be, amazingly well-produced tier 1 Spielberg level videos, right? That's a big part of the reason that it works really well, because for some content, it's okay that it's not the best in the world as long as it serves the purpose, right?
Exactly. That context piece is so important. I mean, when we're looking at hiring people, right, like they need to be interested in economics, politics, entrepreneurship, but they also need to be able to know how to video stuff and edit. Like it's actually a really quite rare skill set for like those 5 things and lots of others things as well. So it's particularly interesting. What are the kind of like status markers when you get to like a SeriesE fundraise? Like what is it now? Like what keeps you going? What keeps you driven? Like what's the motivation? Like it's done so well in the last 10 years. Like what keeps you driven?
I mean, I think what at least for me, and I would guess for most founders, is that you still find
most founders don't get to a SeriesE though, right?
That's true. But I think interest in what you're doing and still feeling intellectually challenged, right? I think ultimately, what I am good at is I'm very curious and I'm very creative. And as long as I get to use those things in my daily job, then, I think I'm still, that's what gives me ambition and drive and motivation. And I think for us, there's just still so much left to do. We talked a bit earlier about those 2 big ideas, right? Like the first one being just video as we know it, but made with AI is a big opportunity. But the second part of it has always been a thing, when we found the company that I've found the most intellectually interesting, which is like, what does AI native video actually look like? There's so many questions to answer within that, right? There's like, what do people actually want? How do you actually build it? What does the UX look like? Does the button need to be blue or red? Like there's so many questions that's like scaffolded onto that question. And that for me is something that is like deeply interesting, and there's still a lot of open-ended uncertainty on how you actually build this. I'm very lucky that I have a great executive team around me that can help me with a lot of the other parts of the business, which is not where I think I'm the best, and is also not the things that give me the most motivation, right? But for example, my co-founder Stefan, we always joked about, like, I wake up in the morning excited to ship a new feature or think about a new part of the product, and Stefan wakes up in the morning excited to sign a new 100K contract with a customer, right? That gives him drive and energy, and so in that way, we're all like different. I think that's what constitutes a good team.
Yeah. And what do you find intellectually interesting about it? And I suppose it's only become more interesting in the last couple of years, actually. Like, it's probably increasing because more people are talking about it. James Marriott in the Times often talking about heading into a post-literate society, etc. Like, what are some of those big intellectual questions that you're posing?
I think for me, I'm generally, outside of work as well, very interested in culture, trends, the zeitgeist, politics, economics. Like, I have a lot of interest, right? And I think what's fun about doing this is that it kind of combines all of those into one thing, right? Like, there's questions around, when thinking about what does AI native video look like, it's not just like what's technically possible. Like, what do people want? Do people actually want to watch AI videos?
Yeah.
Which kind of AI videos do they want to watch, right? So there's so many questions. And I think just that level of, like, finding a solution to a problem drives me. When I was a kid, played lots of computer games. And I think there you train that muscle of, like, you have a problem, you're trying to solve it. And when you solve it, you get a reward for it, which is fun, right? I think the other part of it that has always driven me is there's a level of, less so now, but especially in early days, there's definitely a level of, like, controversy around the technology we were building, right? Because most people saw this AI video thing and they were like, deepfakes, this is gonna be the end of the world. And there are lots
You spoke so much about that, though. I didn't want to head down that.
I've for the first, like, 7 years, it's like basically every Instagram is just like 10 interviews on that. And I mean, it made sense, and I understood why, and there are lots of challenges. Technology is going to be misused, and so on and so forth. I've spoken at length about that. But what I always liked about it was that I always had this thing of, like, people say this about every new technology, right? There's always a moral panic about it. And as we progress through time, some of those things turn out to be true. But, and that's my opinion, of course, most technologies end up being, by far a force for good, right? Like, yes, cars are used by bad people to do bad things, but they're also mainly used for good things. And so I always had that feeling. I'm like, I'm going to prove to the world that this is true. And it gives me energy, actually, that a lot of people, I think it's always given me energy when a lot of people kind of disagree with me, but there's a few very smart people that I truly admire that agree with me.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a different type of thing here, but it's like, it has a bit of an element of the same thing of, like, well, why do people want to interact with these things? How are they going to interact with it, right? And so there's a level of, like, I think, proving myself right, that I can figure out, I can see around corners, and that I can't be the one who can find the solution to what this is going to look like. That definitely gives me energy. That gives me much more energy than kind of maintaining status quo or, just... I don't think I ever would be a great founder of going back to, like, the first stages of my career, like a bookkeeping company, where, like, I think bookkeeping is broken. I can build a product which I can make bookkeeping 20% more efficient, and I can figure out how to be the best in the world at executing a go-to-market function that can capture the market and sell it to someone. There's a lot of intellectual challenges in that, and there's a lot of also creative questions in that. But compared to, I think, what we set out to do in the early days and what we're still doing, it's a very different scale and kind of level of challenge and uncertainty to some extent.
What do you?
And I think maybe the last thing on this is, like, I think just I love science fiction and have since I was a kid. I was eating up science fiction books, and I think what this company gives me and still gives me is the sense that I get to build science fiction. And it's weird because as humans we get very used to technologies very quickly. Like, the fact we have ChatGPT in our pockets, which can literally answer any question you can think of in less than 5 seconds, is, like, mind-blowing, right? But now we're used to that. But I feel very, very grateful that I get to have a front row seat to building technologies that, I mean, we would all think is, like, completely, totally sci-fi 10 years ago, right?
Until it's it. What do you consume? Be it books, newsletters, podcasts, YouTube channels, like, what do you find that, like, piques your intellectual curiosity?
So for books, I still read a lot, but I think for books, I've gone away from reading. I feel like I rarely read business books. I feel like once you've read 50 business books, you've kind of read them all. It's just like the same. There is like really 15 big ideas or something like that. 15 big ideas in business, right? And then people keep taking the same idea, renaming it, coming with like 20 different examples. And I feel like most business people and great entrepreneurs I know kind of come to that realization at some point in time that, they're not like that interesting anymore. The kind of books I actually like reading older books. That are less about like, trends that are happening right now or like AI or something like that, because those books I think often end up being out of date, and I think I get better information online. What I do find very interesting is actually reading books that are 10, 20, 30 years old, even if it's books about technology or business, because it's very interesting to see what people were thinking back then and how the world actually panned out.
Yeah.
Then there's things like philosophy and I think science, right? Ideas that, will stand the test of time because it's science or it's philosophical ideas that's general enough that they're not like, trend based. So I like those kind of books. I think that's really interesting. In terms of my more kind of keeping up to date what's happening, I think obviously I love TikTok. I think a well created TikTok feed is incredibly good. I think the bandwidth of information you can get from short form videos is crazy.
Yeah.
There used to be this article many years ago when I was kind of growing up in tech industry, which is that a book should have been a blog article, right? And I think by now it's like a book could have been a blog article, which could have been a YouTube video, which could have been a TikTok video.
Yeah.
And I think it's truly incredible, speaking of that idea of new formats, how good people are at actually compressing a lot of information in very short videos.
Yeah.
Then of course I'm on X. I listen to a lot of podcasts. And then I also just love surfing the web. I have since I was very young, reading things on Wikipedia, going deep on Reddit, finding fringe ideas. As I said, music is my big passion, but a lot of time like finding music, discovering new music. I really just think like being on the internet is like, it's amazing, right? It's a dangerous rabbit hole as well.
Yeah.
But I'm truly a believer in, there's a lot of like, in business, for example, of course, like learning the lessons of business, reading those business books, great. But I actually think what makes truly great people truly great is often that you connect a lot of like random information that individually probably wouldn't have been in theory very interesting, right? Like when I look at, for example, building the product I built today, I think a lot of the reason that I ended up being, I think the right person to build a tool for people to make AI videos, because throughout my entire childhood, I've dabbled in content creation. I did 3D rendering for a couple of years. And I'm not very good at it, right?
Yeah.
But I was like making maps for Counter-Strike back in the day when I was playing that. I make music in my spare time, so I know how does a synthesizer work, right? How does sampling work? And like, is that relevant for the stuff that we ended up doing directly? No. But it teaches you all these patterns in terms of like UX, in terms of how do people thought about, well, how do we emulate instruments, right? I'm trying to emulate a camera. I think there's so many of like these random things that you learn and do that ends up being very good. And that's why I think most great entrepreneurs generally are very curious people. I can get sucked into like some topic and I'll be obsessed with it for a couple of weeks. And I'll come out of it with, again, learning about some like weird philosophy that probably has nothing to do with business. But at some point, there's like some point in my decision making where my brain probably pulls out something I learned about that and uses that. And so I think that if you really want to grow your intellectual kind of capacity, I think it's actually very important to learn a lot of random things. Yeah. Because it also sets you apart, right? If you're just reading the same newspapers, you listen to the same podcasts, you follow the same X accounts, you have all the same information as everyone else, which means your decision making is going to probably converge to the mean. And the most successful people in life, right, are not the people who converge to the mean, it's the people who think independently.
Yeah.
And so I think you want to actively think about putting information into your brain that's weird or odd outside of the ordinary.
And that's sometimes the point with AI as well, is that actually what it does is take people to the mean, quite often, right? So it's trying to think about how to become an outlier and so on.
Exactly. And I think that's a big danger of it. I think that's hitting the nail on the head there, right? Like, even because I use it a lot also for riffing on like business ideas today, right? Like I'll go like, hey, can you give me an example of like some companies that had the same kind of challenges and how do they solve it? And it's amazing, but you also have to be very cognizant of the fact that it is a reversion to the mean, right?
Yeah.
And it can sound very convincing, even if it maybe shouldn't sound as convincing as it sounds.
It was actually pretty crap today for the prep for 20 minutes questions with you. I will send them to you afterwards because you'll probably find it quite interesting. But it wasn't actually that sort of good on it. I thought it was too rudimentary. What do you think the future of YouTube will be? Bearing in mind this will go out on YouTube as well. Like, it will probably be quite interesting for you to sort of like say. I mean, I know you've talked about TikTok and whatever, but yeah, what does the future of YouTube look like?
It's a good question. I mean, I definitely think that like video as we know it today is, going to be around for long. I don't think it's going to be like replaced by AI video, but I do think we'll see these new formats pop up, right? We've kind of seen much smaller iterations of this already. So one example I often pull out is Twitch. So, we figured out like how to broadcast video and audio on the internet at a, very low cost from the browser, and then can do it from home. Super cool technology, and the question is then, like, okay, great, what's people going to do with it? And probably if you ask McKinsey consultants back then, they'll say people are going to be starting TV stations, you're going to see so many news stations, and like the most like obvious use of that technology, right?
Replacing what was already...
Exactly. And obviously, for most new technologies, it's rarely the most obvious thing that ends up taking off first. It usually is some sort of strange amalgamation of something else, right? And so what we saw here was that people were doing all sorts of like live TV, live streaming things from home. But the one thing that took off, right, was watching other people play computer games, which was completely non-obvious. And they ended up selling Twitch for $1 billion to Amazon. And of course, today it's a massive business, and streaming is a format now, right? Of like, I'm just like sitting at my computer and I'm like just doing random things, like playing a game, doing something else, and just like chatting. Like, no one would have predicted that back in the day. And I think AI is going to have a similar kind of thing that's going to happen, where it's not going to be just these like linear videos. It's probably going to be, these videos you can talk to, as I've kind of described a bit before. It's going to be interactive. Exactly how it's going to pan out is hard to say. We're seeing early inklings. There was a company called, I forgot what it's called. Anyway, name escapes me, but someone built a platform where essentially you could just chat to LLMs, but with the goal of like entertainment, right? So people would go in, and it's like one of the things where if you said that to your mom and dad, they'd be like, who the hell would do that, right? But it turns out that there's a lot of people. I think the average session length was like 2 hours or something of people sitting and chatting to like a fictional character. Some of it is like the virtual girlfriend, boyfriend, which gets into like a little bit of a weird tone. But there's also others. There's like people, generally like you would chat or text with a friend, chatting with these things, right? That is, again, a new entertainment. It's not really a game. It's not really a website either. But it's like a new thing, right? And we're going to see lots of these things that start to pop up. There's a company called Born, which is this app where you basically are two people. And it's a kind of a game. You're two people. And then an LLM, which is like a kind of a game thing, is a penguin. And then it's kind of like a Tamagotchi. But the Tamagotchi is like talking through an LLM, and you're two people who are taking care of the Tamagotchi together, right? This is like a new game format, which is enabled by AI. Like, you wouldn't be able to do this without LLMs. And it again is like an early experiment, but that's actually like that's working really well. It's an early experiment. Like, what does these AI native formats look like? That's probably more like the gaming sector than in the video. But I think with video, we are going to see this stuff as well. I'm very curious what it's going to be. I'm spending most of my time figuring out like what does the enterprise, the corporate version, the business version of these things do. But I think we will start to see these platforms that will look different. I think what's going to be interesting is like how much is it going to look like video and how much is it going to look more like a computer game. That I don't know, right? But it's kind of like those two things is in some sense kind of like melting or merging together.
The melting part of it. That is really interesting. What were your favourite couple of games growing up? What do you play now to sort of...
Roller Coaster Tycoon is probably one of my favorite games. Actually, I still download an emulator sometimes. I have a couple of games from my childhood, like Roller Coaster Tycoon, Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Download these emulators, you can play them, which is great fun. I play a lot of World of Warcraft as well, way too much for my parents' liking. But actually is another good example of, I was speaking about this in another podcast as well. I ran like a really big guild, like a clan when I was like, I don't know, 12, 13 years old. Obviously, we're playing a game and we're killing dragons virtually together. But it's kind of like running a company in some sense, right? Like, you have...
community building, right?
Community building. You have people, like, internal politics. You have to, like, kill the dragon, figure out, like, who gets the loot, how do you distribute it. Like, a lot of those lessons, there's an internal economy in World of Warcraft where you buy and sell things, and I was like, I made like real life money off trading items and characters inside these games, right? So it's like one of those things where like, in the moment, obviously didn't think about, oh, this is going to be great for my business career later on, and my parents definitely didn't think this was going to be great for my business career later on, but it's probably a big part of like why it definitely played a part in like how I ended up like growing up, right? So those are some of my favorite games. Today, I don't really have that much time to game, to be completely honest with you. So when I have free time, I prefer making music.
Yeah.
But
how old are you?
34.
Yeah, okay. Final question. I know you do quite a bit of angel investing.
Yeah.
If you were to sort of like pass the mic to somebody that we should go and have a chat with, who's doing something interesting, who should we get on next?
I think the Fixer guys, FYXER.ai guys, they're doing really well. I think just like,
I can hear Sonny punching the air because he's using that so much at the moment.
Amazing. That they're doing well. They're super hustlers, and I love the story of like they built this agency for virtual assistants, like real human virtual assistants for a long time, which I think kind of like didn't really work, but they learned so much about the workflow that they were the right ones to build the assistant for everyone's emails, which is really great. I think Alan from Fuse.
Yes.
Obviously also, you know, I mean, amazing entrepreneur, was at Revolut for many years, and I think is going to build a generational company in Europe.
He can also double up as one of those first employee interviews at Revolut as
well.
well.
Exactly. He's a total legend. And then actually, Fabian from a company called Born, which is the company that developed this game I was talking about with the penguins. I mean, they're ripping, and I think he's going to be one of the pioneers of figuring out like what are these new media formats. Super creative guy, but comes from a background in gaming and apps, and I mean, as you can probably tell, I'm so curious what in 10 years time, what's gaming gonna look like, what's video gonna look like, how we're gonna learn things at work, how we're gonna interact with customer service, how we're gonna like all those things are gonna change like very significantly, and I think that's like that's just so interesting, and so I love people who are exploring that. Yeah.
You should have your own podcast or YouTube series. I'm serious about it. Thanks for coming on. It's been brilliant. Well done on everything. Can't wait to see where it all goes next.
Yeah.
Thanks, Victor.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. It was fun.